Hello and welcome back to Searching for Service, brought to you by Rotary District 5950. I'm your host, Kelly Kirk.
And I'm Joe Kirk.
Before we share who our guests are today, Joe's going to remind us of our show's sponsor.
Yeah, our show's sponsor is Russell Hampton. Thank you so much for supporting the show. We couldn't do it without you. And Russell Hampton's the largest printer for Rotary. They do everything. It's pretty amazing. Actually, I see their stuff all over the place now. Like, it's really funny now that I see it. It's like the reticular activating system has been triggered and I see it everywhere. And so if you're looking for printing services, think of Russell Hampton. They're amazing.
They've got some amazing stuff. So thank you. That
No,
was wonderful.
thank you.
So in studio today, we have guests. It's always nice to have individuals come in to visit us. It's kind of rejuvenating. We have our CEO of Still Point Insight, Ian Wiliams, and his right-hand man, Justin Baker, the CMO of Still Point Insight. Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having us.
We're happy to have you. And we're I think that this does call for a little bit of background on how we met. And so
we met them out in the parking lot. And
like, hey, you want to come on?
Hey, we need a guest. Come on in.
No, actually, we met you guys through our Rotary meeting. You guys were one of the presenters there and presented on Still Point Insight. And we got some briefing on that and a lot of briefing on Justin and his background too. So it was nice.
Yeah, it was really cool to hear. Well, not only thanks for speaking at the meeting, it was great, but just to hear a lot about the organization, the inspiration for how it started, what you're doing, why you're doing it. It's really, really great. So why don't we just start with that? Like, for our listeners that weren't at the meeting, sorry, you can join Rotary anytime. Is just kind of give us a quick little rundown of the organization that you guys are a part of and what it's all about.
You want to take it? I'll take it. So the organization itself, SPI, we are trying to help do-gooders do more good. That's the very short version. We are organizational consultants, if you want to use the boring term. But Ian and I, neither of us we are not soil scientists. We are not agricultural experts. We are not forestry experts. We are not atmospheric scientists. We're social scientists. And so the best good we can do in the world is bring our social science to organizations who are doing the most impactful work in the world. And what you heard at Rotary is the root of our social science background. For me, that was a whole decade probably of burnout and restlessness and not being sure of what my purpose was in the world, and my long journey to getting my own act together and finding my own self-awareness and sense of purpose was the seed of being able to do this work in my 30s and then eventually Still Point Insight. Ian, do you want to talk about kind of how you ended up here too?
Similar story in terms of personal journey leading to the work. And one of the things that Justin and I connected on very early on in our relationship was the mind-body practices. And so he spent a lot of time at the Rotary meeting talking about his background in Vipassana meditation. My background is a little bit different in terms of how I ended up here, but mind-body was definitely a part of it. So personal story is, professionally, I spent about 10 years in primarily youth education, ended up in the nature-based space. Along the way, had my own environmental awakening, which was kind of layered on top of my own personal journey of addiction and now recovery. And through that recovery and self-discovery process, I also found mind-body practices. And then that's where kind of the whole ethos of the company emerged was there's so much work to be done in the world. And there are so many wonderful organizations and individuals doing that work. We just look at ourselves as this kind of social lubricant to come in and make sure that everything is functioning more effectively, more cohesively, more efficiently, so that they can increase their impact. And we're kind of, operating behind the scenes, so to speak.
Did you hear that, Rotary?
I do like that it's a different form of service, right? And so that was something that spoke to me when Justin got up and spoke on behalf of Still Point Insight, and it struck a chord with me for certain. So I approached afterwards and I was like, hey, do you guys want to come on to the podcast and talk about the way that you're giving back and you're serving? And so we love stories. let's share a story of like one of the most significant impacts that you've seen thus far in maybe collaborations that you've done with individuals or teams or companies at that.
Well, I think the lead in that we were joking about just before the show, right? You working at Luminate. I've worked with a couple different teams there at Luminate Home Loans, and this was, what would it have been, end of 2020, right? So the interest rates are bottom of the barrel in the market, and everybody's going crazy. People are buying homes left and right, and people are selling homes left and right, which also means people are selling loans left and right. And so I showed up originally as a well-being consultant with the team there, the Kim Peterson team. They were the Kim Burke team at the time. And Kim said, we're working 80 hours a week, and this team is giving so much to this business and this company, and we're being compensated well, but our well-being is really, it's taking a hit. And so I showed up originally as a well-being consultant, considering that was their need at the time. And it took, a week and a half to realize there's so much effort going into just making this thing move and stay afloat, that the well-being is almost impossible to actually access in a sustainable way until we fix some of the work processes and systems. And so, to make a long story short, over about 3 to 6 months of work, we took that team from 75 hours down to about 40 a week.
Wow.
And so now we've got some space to have a more sustainable conversation about well-being, right? And I guess the long story over the arc of that, the last couple of years, is that team eventually decided that they would leave, and Kim has now started the first ever 100% female-owned brokerage in the state of Minnesota. So, success story there.
Fascinating. Yeah, very fascinating. And that is a success story. And I think and reflect back just being in that space. And at that time, like it did feel like as soon as the sun was rising, you would need to be at your laptop. And then it would go into the late hours. So to be able to like condense that amount of time that goes into it. And to your point, and my husband can speak to this as well, systems, processes, procedures are so critical to be able to do that. And so it sounds like that's something that's kind of the premise for Still Point Insight.
Yeah, I mean, the backbone of the company has been, since the beginning, again, there's so much wonderful work being done in the world, and also being a part of mission-driven organizations over, my professional career, I just felt like there's a lot of chips being left on the table, right? Because of operational inefficiencies, or because of a lack of alignment, or a lack of strategic direction, or a lack of employee well-being and engagement. I mean, there's so many different things that can hinder an organization. And yet there are, Justin and I obviously love having these conversations. There are simple tactics that any organization can implement to right the ship in rather short order. And, the mission-driven leaders out there who are starting organizations, it's this kind of classic entrepreneurial conundrum of the baker doesn't know how to run a bakery. They started the bakery because they love baking cakes, right? And so how do we give them the skills to run the bakery efficiently so that they can do what they love, and everybody else can be, so that work can actually contribute to their well-being in the process. And so, I was doing that well-being work at the same time Justin was doing his well-being work. And then I realized he's much better suited to do it than I, because I'm much more of the systems process guy. So Joe, maybe you and I could have some interesting exchanges.
It's interesting though. You learn to be a systems processes person, regardless if you want to or not. I mean, I don't know what your journey looked like. But like I had a similar experience in the last 4 years, right? Like where, I went through the same market and had to balance life, and you figure out what's enough. You figure out what's important. You figure out why it's important. You figure out what are the things that fill up your cup, because you can't fill anybody from an empty cup. These are probably things that, you hear all the time, but it's fascinating how systems and processes are at the core of that. And
I
mean, it puts your mind in autopilot versus schizo everywhere. Like, 'cause I'm sure that that's what you see a lot when you go into organizations, is that there's just no concise directionality. It's just, there's people bouncing around in 50 different directions, and it's not going anywhere because they're all working against each other in some way, shape, or form. Maybe not intentionally.
It's one of the many things we see. Yeah. And, and that is, I would say, one of our core insights as a team, that we recognize that well-being or lack thereof can often have its roots in other places, such as systems. And, that's just our personal experience doing those interactions. But one thing I want to say, if there's anyone listening who's saying, oh man, that sounds like the place I work, I do want to say that there's nothing wrong with that. Like, this is usually something that happens when you start from that place of, wow, I have a definitive purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing happens at all unless you can see the impact you want to have and you start working towards it. And at the point when I come to work with an organization, or the two of us come to work with an organization, they're saying, we're dying here, we're all stressed out, please help us. Right? They've already done a lot of things right? They've organized around the impact they're trying to have. They're working hard and they're growing. And that's why this is happening.
Mm-hmm.
And quite often it's people who are very mission driven and very, very oriented around what motivates them emotionally. Those people are often prone to not necessarily having the systems mind to begin with.
Yeah.
We can't be good at everything,
Mm-hmm.
but like, that's why Ian and I exist.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we understand your mission. We care deeply about it. We can just help you fill in those gaps. Nobody starts an organization with 3 people and thinks, man, I can't wait till this is 200. I know exactly how to run a 200-person organization. I don't know anyone like that. I've never met an entrepreneur like that.
Do you find that scale is the most difficult component for a lot of these organizations, where like they started at a certain point where they were in their comfort zone, everybody had a role that seemed to fit, and then it exploded or it got bigger, and now all of a sudden they're like, I don't know how to manage people. I don't know how to keep them busy. I don't know why all of our people keep quitting. Oh, it's because you have no standard operating practices.
Right.
So they have no idea what to do.
I can't nod my head any harder, and I'm not sure Ian can either. And what happens, it's not scale itself that's the problem. It's that as things scale, the roles and responsibilities change. Right. And the relationships change. When it's just the 4 of us in a room, we can run a great podcast and make eye contact with each other, and this relationship is easy. Right. Then what happens when we're not in the same room together anymore? Or what happens when we hire 50 more people and they're all out there and we don't have this, face-to-face relationship every day? Right? That's a completely different dynamic. And that's not how we started. And all of a sudden, my job becomes very different. I have to manage people that I'm not having this intimate relationship with.
Do you find a little bit of founderitis sometimes in organizations, where the founder or the person at the tip of the spear is trying to do all of the things and is kind of the root of the breakdown?
That can be the case. It certainly wouldn't be good business practice for us to sit here and say, yes, we see that all the time, because we work with a lot of those leaders. But the reality of the situation,
not any of you listening to this.
Yeah.
The reality of the situation is, to Justin's point, an organization grows, and as it's going through a growth process, the needs of the organization change, right? So to your earlier question about, is it the scale that does that? What we found is that with these smaller organizations, a big challenge as they're growing from 1 employee to 100 is, how do we just maintain the cultural roots, right, of the startup, right, where everybody's orienting around this mission that's important to them. And then once you're going from 100 to 500, the challenges are totally different, because now you need a durable organizational infrastructure that scales. And so there's these different transition points in an organization's life, right? And to your point, or your question, Joe, one of those is, what is the role of the leader or the founder in that organization, right? And part of what Justin and I bring is this: we're just trying to bring some self-awareness to the organization itself, and to do that in a way that not only creates a safe space, but creates a space that is conducive to leaning into that discomfort, right? And so some leaders are simply prone to being very self-aware, right? And to recognize that the way to lead is actually to serve, to bring it back to the right topic of the podcast here. And certainly there are founders out there that might have a case of the founderitis, but the reality is, at the core, they still started it for a reason, right? And if that reason was service, then we want to help be a part of that service.
Hmm.
Well, and for our listeners, I mean, you can kind of understand why we had you guys on here. Like, I mean, Rotary is going through a really interesting organizational shift, and it's just been so powerful to listen to you guys and present some information on, you know, what you see as challenges as you're going into organizations, and how do you get out of that, and how do you continue to foster growth? How do you continue to acknowledge all seats at the table too, because I mean, Rotary as an organization is getting younger, and that divide as an age group is very interesting. I mean, even at the club level, but I mean, you see it play out at the district and Rotary International level, where, I mean, this podcast is a perfect example. We say it all the time. This is an example of something that is desired by people our age, but
Mhm.
we're explaining it in the meetings sometimes, and they're like, what's a podcast? But that's realistically what the barriers are, right? Is the difference between somebody that has no idea what a podcast is and somebody that's thirsting for it. And then you think about it, we have to raise money for this, right? And so depending on who's at the table for raising money, do they even understand it? Do they understand the impact? Do they understand where Rotary's trying to go versus where Rotary is? So I just want to kind of bring our listeners along with us, because I think we're like in gear 4, because we've talked, or we've heard you talk, and then we've talked a little bit before the show, is to kind of understand the purpose of having you guys on the show, and then also
Mm-hmm.
how impactful this can be to Rotary, just to listen and to understand that there is going to be similarities between Rotary and these examples that you're going to use, throughout this podcast. So was that helpful, audience? Say yes.
People are in their
If
cars
not,
right
that was
now,
just like my
nodding and saying
30-minute
yes.
monologue there.
No, it was. I thought that was a good little tie-in, and so a good parallel, if you will.
Yeah, I hear what you guys are saying, and for service organizations which are a little more decentralized, which I assume Rotary is.
Yeah, no.
No?
Yes and no. Like, it is and it isn't. Like, it's very interesting. The structure of Rotary is incredible. Like, I guess the best way to put it is things flow down well, flow up could use some work, in my opinion. For those that are listening, you can disagree with me or not, but but truly, like, it flows from Rotary International and it diffuses down. So when you talk about those structural components of a large organization, they have those. But what's happening is the bottom of that organization is really beginning to change a lot.
Yeah.
And the way it's made up. I mean, we've changed the functionality of how clubs operate. We've got cause-based clubs, which are completely different than the club that you were in. It's, we have a veterans club. We have a LGBTQ club. We have a global travelers club. And so these people geographically don't matter, but they all like to travel. And so that's how they coordinate. That's how they serve. So all of those dynamics are changing within Rotary. And it's just so fascinating to hear it through your lens, like why that's important to listen to, and how to effectively bridge those gaps too.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like regardless of what all the different little pieces of Rotary are doing, they're all working toward a mission.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so again, you have a lot of people who care about what they're doing, but like, what are the structures that are going to allow those pieces to coordinate effectively toward that purpose,
The
to
same
channel their
mission.
energy? And yeah, from the sound of things, that's not necessarily an easy task. An organization that's as wide ranging and global. I mean, my understanding is it's a huge global organization at this point. Yes,
it's the largest service organization in the world.
Yes. Okay, so what I read was true.
Yes.
Yeah, and that was actually the reason I brought that Vipassana example to Rotary, because I mean, in addition to telling my own story of the impact of self-awareness and how that turned me into a person of service, I also thought, as I went through my own training, like, what a fascinating organization this is, and how that mission is distilled. I mean, like I said, the mastermind behind the whole thing has been dead for over 10 years.
Yeah.
And that organization just keeps humming along. And that mission remains incredibly pure because of how they have structured it. And no other organization could probably organize itself in that way.
I did a little bit of a deep dive into it.
You
I
did?
was like, oh my gosh, it's pretty incredible.
We'll
And, you know,
provide
like,
some resources
Yeah.
too on the show page when
Yeah.
we air this episode.
Well, if you don't mind me asking, could you name like one thing that you thought was really interesting about it?
Well, I will say that the component of like what I was reading was that you don't pay. Like you do not have to pay, and they do not allow you to pay until after you have successfully gone through 10 days for this silent retreat, which that in itself, like I am actually quite interested. I haven't even shared this with my husband. I'm like quite interested with it.
Uh-oh.
I know it's like 10 days. I'm like, can I afford to be gone for 10 days?
You can.
For my well-being, yes.
I would recommend 12, honestly.
With the right systems, in place, you can be gone for 10 days. Yeah.
There you go. I like that tie, Eddie. That's good.
Yes.
But just back to that. And you don't even have to. You don't even have to make a contribution. They're like, if you want to, but it's all off of volunteerism.
Mm-hmm.
And that's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. Like out of the goodness of people's hearts, they are going, I'm going to be here for 10 days. I'm going to be in support of this. And the only way that you can like become a teacher is if you have like successfully gone through it a couple of times, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And how you become a teacher is even wilder, because I was actually, and this is not like publicly posted on their website. I actually asked, I was carpooling to a center in Illinois with a more senior service team person, a server. And there were the student and I who were in the back seat, how do you become a teacher? Is there an application process? And that's exactly how the person driving the car acted. Oh no.
Yeah.
If you were interested in becoming a teacher, that would disqualify you from becoming a teacher.
Fascinating.
Because that suggests that there's ego involved, that you're seeking status.
Yeah.
Ian is nodding his head. He knows
Well,
exactly what I'm talking about.
yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about how
Yeah.
this is something that we face often, where it's like, well, okay, you both have these mind-body backgrounds and you both have these personal transformation journeys. How does that qualify you to do this work in an organization?
Incredibly well so, by the way.
Thank you. But there's an analogy floating through my head right now, which is, so if I can try and draw a parallel here between mind, body, and organizations themselves. If you think about mind, body practices, many of them are around orienting us to having awareness around the five senses, right? And so we're all familiar with these five senses. And yet how many of us take the time to think about how the fact that each of the five senses is actually oriented outward, right? They're outward sense perceptors, right? And so there's nothing really well designed in the human body to observe the human body. So this is why these mind-body practices are really relevant, right? It's why they can be so powerful and transformational, because they give us the ability, the skills to perceive inward, which is an entirely different terrain, right? It's an entirely different landscape. And I think there's hopefully an elegant analogy here between the same thing that's happening in organizations, right? To your earlier question, Joe, about like leadership and these systems, and an organization isn't necessarily well designed to perceive within itself.
Sure.
Because it is mission centric.
Yeah.
It is trying to serve, right? It has customers or a need that it is trying to meet in the outer world. And so one of the ways that Justin and I sometimes talk about this internally is like, we just become those outside sense perceptors, right? It's easier for us as the neutral third party, so to speak, to look into an organization and to understand, efficiencies or lack thereof, and maybe discrepancies or gaps, because we are not in the organization. We are not a part of it. And so that gives us a unique perspective, but it's also part of what we're trying to bring into our work, right? Is if we can build this level of self-awareness with every individual within the organization, now the organization itself becoming much more resilient, right? And so there's also this kind of nature parallel here too, right? Something I say all the time is that diversity in nature is actually what creates resilience. And so we're trying to create that diversity in a healthy way, not only within ourselves through these mind-body practices that we practice individually, but also within the organizations that we're working with. How do we create that level of, diversity and resilience through awareness?
It's It's interesting. I heard a really great quote recently, and it was regarding letting go. And you know, he more or less he talked about letting go allows the ego to rest. And I was like, ooh, because like I struggle with ego all the time, and I'm actually kind of a smart ass, right? Like, and I kind of play the devil's advocate side, like, you know, oh, I hate being right all the time, and like, you know, whatever. And I'm just trying to be funny, but it's what's really funny is like, but there is a piece of it is like, yep, I'm right, and there's that ego component, and I bet that a lot of your work is helping people identify their own egos and how it interacts with other people's egos. Because when you have a lot of tension within an organization, it could be that you have very similar egos battling for the very same things, or they're just against, and they just don't understand each other. And so, like, just letting go and being able to go, like the idea when you said, I don't know if I can break away for 10 days. Like your world's gonna fall apart in 10 days. Like,
are you giving, or do I have the permission?
Oh, you always have permission.
I'm gonna come back to you guys enlightened, okay?
Yes, follow-up pod after Kelly has completed her 10 days.
I mean, in all seriousness, though, I was reading through it, and I, like, after you had come to our Rotary meeting and you talked about this 10 days, I was like, I could totally do that, and I need to do it. I need to do it. And then when I started like reading through everything, like I did a deep dive, and it's just over in Menominee and it's not too far away.
Yeah.
And then I was like, ooh, that's 10 days away from my baby doll, our daughter. I'm like, I can do the breakaway from him. That's fine. But from her, I'm like, I'm just not
She's like,
sure.
I actually need it.
No. And we can talk
man.
off air more about it. But I mean, it's interesting because to kind of bring this to the realities of life now, it's like, we're just kind of being bombarded all the time with all of these things, whether it's on the professional, on a professional platform, or it's on a social platform, or this or that. And you think about it, it's like our brains just need that break.
I mean,
10 days.
Think
10
really
days.
think about this. Like I really liked it reading your bio, by the way. And I'm talking to Ian. And he sent it an hour before the show. So I was well. No, it's okay. It's okay. Actually, the little secret to the show is, you know, one of the secrets to the hosts is we try not to be too informed, because we can allow the conversation to go places where otherwise, if we're trying to follow a very succinct path, you can miss those really special moments. And you know, look at cultures all over the world. You've got Aborigines that do walkabouts, right? They leave and they go. Like, think of biblical stories. You think of all of these things over and over again. People leave and come back, and they have a moment of silence with themselves, or just time with themselves, and come back. And the power around that, of that self-awareness, like what you guys are saying, is, and you think about how difficult it is to unplug from our society. Like, either it's, I can't miss a day of school, I can't miss a sports event, I can't miss a day of my child, I can't miss work, or this appointment or that appointment, and we convince ourselves that, you know, we're at the mercy of everything else, when the reality is until you figure that out, you will be at the mercy of all of that. And I would love to hear just a little bit more about, how did you guys discover that in yourself? Because I'm guessing you guys both said the word burnout. That's being at the mercy of everybody else. That's burnout, and trying to convince everybody else that you're the greatest worker, that you're worth something. You know, like, what was the aha moments for both of you?
All right, if I can clarify your question, do you mean the aha moment that led each of us to realize, oh man, we need to do something? Maybe
your rock bottom. Let's do that.
Is that kind of what you were getting at?
Well,
okay.
I don't know where I was going.
I think it's where you go. You want to take it first? No, you don't. Okay.
We call that dead air in the business.
I'm actually really interested to hear Justin's rock bottom moment.
I will do the parts that are safe for radio.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
So you heard one of the stories at the Rotary meeting where I was very burned out in my advertising career, and I thought I need a new job. And then I walked into what was really a great interview situation. And when the person I was sitting in front of told me, hey, this job is a great fit, it's going to be a lot like your current job. And I got so nauseous, I almost lost it on this poor man's desk. I did not, but I bombed the interview and I realized I cannot be in advertising. And that state of ill ease and restlessness and not feeling well really persisted for about 3 years. I quit advertising and then I moved to Chicago, and I was coaching tennis and freelance writing for a while. But like that feeling wasn't going away. And then it was actually right when I moved to the Twin Cities, there was a bunch of things that happened in a very short period of time. My very good friend from college and my roommate developed a pretty serious mental illness, and I was living with him, and it was really wearing on me. And then a really close friend of mine had his fiance die suddenly.
Wow.
And then I was, like really walking side by side with him through that funeral. And that was really rough. And then Robin, I hope you're not listening, she went through a really rough divorce. And, she's my closest family member. And I like flew down to where she lived and was like walking through her with that. And what struck me was none of these things were happening directly to me. These were just like loved ones in my life. And I became like so overwhelmed emotionally that I couldn't cope. I was having trouble sleeping. I was totally restless. I couldn't focus at work.
Yeah, your cup was empty.
It was empty. And I always felt like I had coping mechanisms in my life. I was an active person. I felt like I had ways of dealing with whatever stress there was, but I was like, my coping mechanisms aren't working anymore. I feel completely fried and zapped out. I feel totally restless and directionless in my life. And I went on a mental health campaign. And I tried getting a therapist, and I tried going to 12-step meetings because I am from a long line of male alcoholics, although I was fortunate not to actually become an addict myself. So I went to, I think it's Al-Anon when you're family of an addict.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So some Al-Anon meetings. And then, as I mentioned in the talk, the girl I was dating said, hey, you should try this Vipassana 10-day thing. And I'd heard of it because I had an uncle who had done it a million years ago, who was an aging hippie. He's a good man.
Love it.
He's not living in a van anywhere. He's a lawyer, but
there you go.
You can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, there's something to that.
But
right?
he was one of those guys who went to India when he was in his 20s. In the 1970s. And I tried all of those things, and the 10-day was what changed my life. That was the walkabout. That was the letting go. That was the window I needed into my internal world that I had not had until that point in my life.
A moment of filling your cup.
Well,
you're just
witness
pushing me closer to that. Justin.
Yeah, it's no one teaches us. I mean, maybe if you're not, I don't know, raised as an athlete in American male culture, but nobody ever taught me how to gaze inward and understand anything that was happening inside of me.
Just be tough and figure it out.
Exactly.
Be there for other people.
Sure. Yeah. Fight harder, be tougher.
Yeah.
Shove it
Suck
down.
less.
Yeah. Suck less.
Well, Ian, we want to ensure that you've got enough time to share your
he seated the ground there. He asked for it.
Yeah. No, that was a great question. Thanks for I've never asked that question to Justin, so it's always wonderful to grow closer.
That was the PG version.
As we
I'll
go
give you the
this
real one.
Yeah. The off-air conversation. We have plenty of those. I would say that my rock bottom moment was also, one of the highest moments of my life. I've told this story on a number of podcasts before. But I mentioned earlier in the podcast, I have an addiction and recovery story. So at this time in my life, 2013, I'm about 10 years into my addiction journey, which lasted about 12 total. And I had this beautiful American Staffordshire Terrier pit bull, and she was the love of my life. And she was in my life for about 4 or 5 years. And she had her own mental health issues. And so as a family, we made a very difficult decision to put her down early. She was probably, we think, about 6 when we let her go. And that was on December 30th of 2013. And a couple days later, I was laying in bed awake, staring at the ceiling in the middle of the night, and she came back to visit me. She poked her nose into the room, hopped up on the bed next to me. I could see her and I could hear her, but she didn't make an imprint on the mattress. She curled up next to me and she let out this sigh that she always let out when she goes to bed. And I rolled over and I fell asleep instantly. And the next morning I woke up and I was journaling as a way to process my emotions at this time in life. And I started writing about the experience as if it were a dream. And I realized during that writing session that I was actually awake when this happened. And it was this completely profound, unexplainable, mystical experience. And it was a great thing that I was home alone. I've never had an ugly cry like that before, nor have I ever had one like that since. But that
I'm
was
trying not to get emotional right now.
yeah,
actually.
it's still an emotional story for me to tell. But that was the turning point for me, right? Because it was not only within the context of where I was at in life at the time, which is so frustrated with my behaviors and myself, and knowing that I wanted to change so deeply and just feeling like I had zero skills to do it. But then to have this mystical experience that completely shattered my perception of reality, right? I mean, it just blew the door off the hinges. And I knew in that moment, okay, all of this spiritual stuff is real, right? There is something beyond the veil. And, you know, at the time, as a naive young buck that I was like, I'm going to go figure this out. And so that week I went to my first yoga class. And then a couple months later, I started sitting meditation. And then a couple months after that, Qigong, and then Tai Chi and martial arts. And it just became the snowball effect. But that was really the catalyst moment for me, which was, you know, the turning point, which also really marked the beginning of a deep journey inward.
You know, you made a comment earlier that I kind of went, really? Like, because you get questions sometimes like, what makes you qualified? And I will take somebody who has walked through hell and figured it out over somebody that has studied every book ever made, that knows
Without
the
much
way.
trials
But
or
until you've walked it, until you've understood it, like it's really interesting. Like, I've always had an affinity for coaching and helping other people, and you know, and I remember when I took on my coach, and he's like, "You're not ready." And I was like, "What do you mean I'm not ready? I know." And he's like, "Yeah, but you haven't done it." Like, damn. Like, so right. And like, as I've done it, I understand why. Like, I understand today what he meant that day. And I was like, man, that's real. That's real. Like, you have to live life. You have to figure this out. You have to have those experiences. You have to be able to, because you run into people probably a lot that think they know, but they haven't walked the journey. And you have, and you can provide that spiritual insight, some of those things that, you know, the ego blinds. Like, that's a big thing for me that I've figured out in my life, is that the ego blinds you badly. Like, you talk about the veil, the ego is the veil for the individual, and it keeps you from looking inside. It keeps you from looking it. And it's literally the thing that you wrap over yourself to make you feel better. But, you know, and just to kind of like, as I can't believe we're
we
38
need more
minutes
time
into this interview. It's incredible.
We need more time.
But kind of the last thing I'd love to hear from you guys is like, where do you see this going? And like, where do you want it to go? Do you want to have to bring in people just like yourselves in your organization one day and go, man, we're growing so rapidly, we don't even know what we're doing anymore?
Yeah.
I think what would be wonderful is if there were a place where we weren't even needed.
Sure.
I don't think we're going to get to that place while we're alive.
That is what every single service group that comes in here says. We wish.
Yeah.
So it's so cool to hear that is a very similar goal for you guys, is to eliminate the need for you. Well, you're probably not going to do that. So I like the aspiration. So what's the next step? Like, what's the goal?
Yeah.
Like, what's the goal of the organization?
Well, first of all, it's good to hear that that's what most service people say. And I would say that is definitely a strong indicator of a service orientation. And I'd say that is why, for instance, Vipassana servers are not allowed to be servers until they have completed the course. because it is not until after that 10 days that you have reached that particular orientation
Mhm.
where you have overcome your ego and seen your own suffering and recognized suffering in others. And then, oh, the only point of being here is to help alleviate that suffering in other people. That's it. Right. And when you're doing service, that's it. So how do we alleviate more suffering? For us, we're very interested in working with, the social and environmental impact organizations. And I think a short-term goal for us is to do something to stem the tide of this mass extinction of our global ecosystem. And obviously that's a pretty tall order too. You can chime in on this one. I mean, right now, the short-term goal is probably to extend the carbon timeline, right? Was IPC saying like 2030, if we don't do anything by 2030, point of no return? Is that about right?
Yeah, the IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, suggests we need to reduce global carbon emissions by 50% total by 2030, and we need to get to net zero by 2050. So, if you look at what that's going to take, right? I mean, sometimes we're having a hard
Interest
time.
rates aren't coming down anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, probably, hundreds of trillions of dollars to make that work in the end. But the tall order of the task paired with the tight timeline that we are on is something that that's honestly what keeps me up at night, and is why this company exists in the first place. Because, as Justin was saying, we're really interested in serving the organizations that are focused on social and environmental impact, because those are the missions that we personally care about. But we're not necessarily, as he started off the podcast, like, we're not specialists. We ourselves are generalists, and we're kind of agnostic to the solutions. We just know that there's a huge pie of problems to be solved, and we want to be a part of doing what we can to solve those problems. And so, to answer your question a little bit more directly myself, Joe, like, what we're trying to do is build the premier resource for mission-driven organizations. And that resource of information is not just one that is intellectual information, but we're also trying to provide experiential information, experiential understanding, right? And we try and differentiate between those two things. And so if we can deliver those skills, for lack of a better term, in a direct way or a decentralized way, right, to provide the support that these mission-driven organizations who have said this is the problem we are trying to solve, right, whether it's deforestation or farming or all of the social injustices that exist in the world, no matter what lane those people are in, the organizations themselves largely need similar support, right? And so we're just trying to provide that support, and we're trying to do it in a effective and efficient way, because if there's someone out there who's got business development experience, you might be able to call me out on bad business strategy, but we're not really looking to bring customers in and keep them for life. We're looking to work with organizations and clients that need the skills, but then they become self-sufficient themselves, right? Because there are so many organizations that need these skills. And so,
and you do that enough, and then the thing that keeps you awake should actually be the thing that gives you some inspiration for humanity. Because, like, it's so funny when you said the thing that keeps you awake. I'm like, that's the thing I believe most in humanity. I'm an optimist. I'm like, when the rubber meets the road, we tend to figure things out. Like, it's always too late. It's always later than we want it to be. Okay. Like, we're always the kid the night before the test. We cram and we pass it. So it's never on the timeline like what you're talking about, where you're like, it'd be great if we just didn't have to deal with this at all. You're right.
We'll do the right thing when we've exhausted all the other options.
Correct.
Yeah.
And to
notice the eye roll. It's like,
to root this in, the Vipassana, which is how this all started, right? Justin's talk about Vipassana. It's that ability to practice awareness, right? And to your comment earlier about how it's hard to unplug from our culture. Like the convenience and the entertainment are not inherently bad themselves. I personally, I think Justin and I might have different views on ego. I think it gets a bad rap. But what they do is they don't provide the space for us to really ask these deeper questions, right? To really
Right.
lean in and go
Mm-hmm.
to the depths within ourselves, within society, right?
Yeah.
Environmentally. And that in the end will be our demise if we can't figure it out. And so
Mm.
the opportunity to do this work as individuals, right? And to serve other individuals that are doing this work. I mean, you heard what keeps me up at night, but it's also, this is what gets me out of bed in the morning, like you said.
I love
That's
it.
so
What a
good.
what a great way to end her. That was
I
a good
know, I
mic
wish
drop
we didn't
moment.
have to
I know.
tap out on this one because we could go for hours and hours. But truly, guys, thank you for coming in on a whim too. I know that I kind of like approached you like afterwards, and you're like, "Wait,
She does that.
What is?" Oh, sure. Well, we can come on the show. That's fine. So I thank you greatly for coming on and speaking your voices regarding Still Point Insight and your stories as well. It's great. I'm your host, Kelly Kirk.
And I'm Joe Kirk.
We'll be back.